Welcome back. So last time we talked about imperialism in Africa and how Africa would be divided up into all of that. So today we're going to focus on Asia. First thing we're going to talk about actually is, in Africa, Egypt. So, the United Kingdom, the British, have started taking over colonial possessions in Asia. And so, they're interested in being able to get there quickly, both for two reasons. One, if they need to send their military in for protection or to stop a rebellion. And the second reason is it's cheaper if you can get to the raw materials more quickly. So, the French had started building a canal right here in Egypt, connecting the Red Sea with the Mediterranean Sea, with the hope of cutting the trip to Asia short. So, the Red Sea, there's this narrow strip here, and then you can sail ocean-sized ships all the way out to the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. And so the British are actually going to show up in 1882 and occupy Egypt and turn it into a protectorate with the sole purpose of protecting their way to get to India. So India is going to make them a ton of money. We'll look at that next class. But the Suez Canal is important. The British take over Egypt and make it a protectorate solely so they have protected access to India. And like I said, this is a great example of a protectorate. They're there to protect their other possessions in Asia. Now, let's get into Asia here. So China, we're going to look at a map in a second, is going to be broken up into those spheres of influences we talked about. Sometimes on your SOL test they call that an enclave, this word. An enclave is a small group. So spheres of influence tend to be like a specific area where you are required to trade with one particular European country. Now, the United States had gotten left behind in all this. So the United States is going to institute something we call the open door policy. The U.S. is going to, force is the only fair word, China to trade with everyone. And the goal of this is to prevent more colonization of China. It's not actually, if you are not one of the countries that is getting a piece of the pie, you actually don't want China to be colonized. And then later on down the road, what we end up with are the Opium Wars, which are the big outcome you're supposed to know, actually. So the U.S. gets involved. Next thing you know, we've got the Opium Wars. This is the first time we're going to see the U.S. starting to get involved in world politics. It's been about 100 years of developing into a country. By the 1900s, the U.S. is a fairly large, powerful country. So let's look at the Opium Wars. Here we have the spheres of influence. Everything in color on here is a sphere of influence. This is showing you in green the British-controlled areas, in yellow the French, in red the little German area. Purple is Japanese, so they are unique because they are Asian, they're not European like the others. And then Russia up at the top there. So you know about Al Capone. You know about Pablo Escobar and the movie Scarface. What you might not know about is this lady, Queen Victoria. There's actually a new show on PBS about her called Victoria, with the girl from Doctor Who, if you want to check that out. She ends up essentially being a gigantic drug dealer. That's not her only thing she does, but what it leads to is just chaos in China. So the British are growing the plants that opium is related to heroin, come from. It's called poppy, in some of their other colonies like Afghanistan and India and Pakistan. What today is Pakistan. And they are selling this drug to the Chinese. It is totally destroying members of the Chinese society. So they are going to ask the British to stop importing this super dangerous, highly addictive drug. And Queen Victoria is going to just keep on doing it. This is a very lucrative business. It is not in the United Kingdom's best interest to stop doing this, and so they keep on selling it. It's going to lead to actual wars over the foreign people being able to sell the opium there. Now, it's a sphere of influence, is the whole point as far as the Europeans are concerned. The Chinese want the opium out. Now, opium wars, the British win. The Europeans win. Down the road, it's going to lead to a second round of fighting called the Boxer Rebellion. So we have these poor Chinese people. They feel like the reason China is not doing well is because of all this negative foreign influence from the different European nations. And they're going to lead a rebellion. It's called the Boxer Rebellion. So the Europeans had joined together in a group called the Eight Nations. So they were the British, the United Kingdom, the U.S., Germany, France, Russia, Italy, Japan. And they're going to put down everybody. So this Boxer Rebellion is to get rid of them, and the Europeans actually win. It's going to be the beginning of the end for China as we know it. In about 50 years, it's going to be a total change in the way Chinese society operates from then until now. And it starts with all this colonization. So here's a picture of the Eight Nations. There's actually a couple extras because we have an Australian. This is the Australian. And we have an Indian in here. They're part of the British Empire. But that's why the numbers are funny. But this is a picture of the troops that are brought in to put down the Boxer Rebellion. Now, on to Japan. Japan is, like China, had cut themselves off from the other countries. They're still ruled by the Tokugawa shogunate that we talked about at the very beginning of the year. This is the feudal system, just like they had in Europe, except their government has not changed. So we've seen all kinds of revolutions, changes in the way the kings operate. In Japan, it's all the same. You have the shogun in charge. He's running everything. The emperor is technically the highest ranking guy, but he has only been doing religious things. So the guy running the show is the shogun. It's a good one. Now, the U.S. wants to trade with Japan. We've got this brand new navy. We send over Matthew Perry. He's going to take our first steamships that we have in our navy over to Japan and kind of intimidate them into trading with us. And we end up with this treaty, which works out well for both sides, actually, but at the time, it probably seemed very one-sided to the Americans. So here's the big thing. Creates peace and friendship between the U.S. and Japan. So they're going to be our allies. We are allowed to use a couple ports in Japan. If there is a wrecked ship, we can ask for help, and we are allowed to stop and restock our ships in Japan. So no one else is allowed to do these things. So that is a big deal that the U.S. Gets all this stuff in writing. Japan was not friendly with the European countries, the other Western countries. So this is a big deal for the United States. I'll skip over these videos. Now, the end result in Japan is it's going to totally destroy the existing system. So we end up with something called the Meiji Restoration, just like the Restoration in England. They're restoring the power of the emperor. So the emperor is being restored to power, the Meiji Restoration. Now, the people thought that the shogun had given in too much to the United States, and they want him out, and they're going to convince the emperor to take back over. So from this point on, the emperor is in charge. He's going to operate just like a king. Now, because they had agreed to trade with the U.S., they get access to all that technology, and it's going to, in a short time, in about 50 years, Japan's going to be a completely modern country. Now, meanwhile, the Russians have been expanding and expanding into China, and they've basically gotten as far as they can go without going to war with the British Empire. Now, the Queen of England is Queen Victoria. She's cousins of the Tsar or King of Russia, so they know each other. They have no interest in fighting. So what Russia does is they turn the other direction. They focus on the rest of Asia. So they're going to move into China, and they're going to move into Korea. The only problem is the Japanese also want Korea. And just like we talked about with Russia before, the big thing is they wanted warm weather seaports on the Pacific Ocean. It's what we talked about with Catherine and Peter at the beginning of the year. Now, this leads to a war. The Russians think they're going to totally beat up on little teeny backwards Japan, but Japan has gotten all the technology for the U.S. Japanese win. It leads to Japanese imperialism, and they are going to take over Korea as a protectorate. It's also going to, in the near future, lead to Tsar Nicholas getting kicked out and there being a revolution in Russia. So here you can see, here's Japan, here's Korea that they were fighting over, and Russia had taken over all of this stuff here. So next time, we'll be talking about India and the impacts on imperialism in India.